It becomes very easy, I think, for people to say, there's no real evidence. Yes, you have some survivor reports. Yes, some people have analyzed the medical data to show that there's an increased rate of sterilization. But really, like, where are the images? In such a situation, isn't it easier for us to all just look away?
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, Editor-in-chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. On his Facebook page last week, Elisha Wiesel, the son of the late Holocaust survivor and Nobel Prize laureate Elie Wiesel, had a poignant accusation for the world, and especially for those who revere the lessons his father tried to impart about the importance of speaking up against atrocities and totalitarian regimes. The evening after millions had tuned in to the opening ceremony of the 2022 Winter Olympics in Beijing, and after he had witnessed only a few paltry souls turning up in New York City's Times Square to protest the holding of the sports extravaganza in the capital of a nation that is currently committing genocide against its own citizens, he came to a stark conclusion. He said, quote, "I know now that we have failed my father in this regard. He did not fail us. He spoke of how he always felt he had to answer to the dead. Did he do enough? And yes, he did. He was there to speak up against atrocities in Darfur, Bosnia, Cambodia, Rwanda. He tried with everything he had to tell us. And all the words he spoke and wrote could not change the fact that 5 years after his death, 1 million people are reportedly in concentration camps because of their race and religion, in the grip of a totalitarian regime. And this regime is honored today to host the world's nations," unquote. He's right about that. As Wiesel points out, over the past year, there have been plenty of opportunities for lobbying the CEOs of the companies that sponsor the Olympics, as well as NBC, which is broadcasting the event on its various channels and streaming platforms. They had enough clout to demand a venue change in spite of the Chinese winning the bid to host them in 2015. But despite the fact that virtually no one in the civilized world disputes the facts about the horrors being visited on the Uyghurs who live in the western province of Xinjiang, it's been business as usual for the overwhelming majority of companies, corporations, entertainment providers, and sports leagues who do business in China. To state it plainly, the most egregious violations of human rights, involving murder, rape, forced sterilization, enslavement, and forced population transfers away from their homes, have been carried out by the regime run by the Chinese Communist Party, and most of the rest of the world simply doesn't care. Not everyone has stated this as plainly as Chamath Palihapitiya, the owner of the National Basketball Association's Golden State Warriors, who said on a podcast that, quote, "Nobody cares about what's happening to the Uyghurs, okay? You bring it up because you care, and I think it's nice that you care. The rest of us don't care," unquote. Some in the NBA, most notably Enes Kanter, the Turkish-born Boston Celtics player who is an outspoken advocate for human rights, pushed back at those comments. But they reflected the mindset that has governed the league's approach to China that was also expressed by superstar LeBron James, who on other issues poses as an activist. The hypocrisy there and elsewhere in the sports and corporate world is unmistakable. Few are more woke than the NBA, with its constant drumbeat of advocacy for the Black Lives Matter movement. But it has made it clear that nothing, least of all worries about genocide or the suppression of democracy in supposedly autonomous Hong Kong, is to interfere with its efforts to break into the Chinese market. The same is true for many other businesses who grandstanded in the spring of last year about how awful a new voting law passed in the state of Georgia supposedly was, leading to boycotts of the state, including the moving of Major League Baseball's All-Star Game from Atlanta. This was mere partisan gaslighting, since the law actually did nothing to impede anyone's right to vote, let alone constituting Jim Crow 2.0, as President Joe Biden mischaracterized it. But the same people who were so outraged about that largely fake concern are strangely unmoved by genocide in China. To his credit, Biden did mention human rights concerns in a virtual conference call with Chinese President Xi Jinping last fall. But his gentle remonstrances, with no talk of consequences, sent a clear message that the United States was merely paying lip service to these concerns. So did Biden's empty gesture, in which he declared a diplomatic boycott of the Olympic Games, which meant that officials, who would never be missed, would stay away while everyone else went. Biden lacked the guts to defy the sports establishment and the corporations who have invested billions in China to declare a true boycott. But there was also little evidence that many people really cared enough about it for it to be worth the expenditure of any political capital on the issue. Many in his party have been sending clear signals that they actually don't think America has the right to speak up about human rights issues because of our own shortcomings. To her shame, Vice President Kamala Harris recently sounded what is becoming a familiar note on the political left, in which advocacy for toxic myths like critical race theory disqualifies the United States from having an opinion about China. America has a troubled history and is not perfect today. But do we really think our own shortcomings should have prevented Americans from saving the world from Nazism or defeating Soviet communism in the 20th century? Despite the isolationism that is always a factor in American politics, the notion that everybody doesn't care about China is false. There may be a number of explanations for the severe decline in ratings, which are down 43% from the 2018 Games for NBC's broadcast of the Olympic opening ceremonies in Beijing. But it is also true that Americans are more turned off by an Olympics being held in a country committing genocide than the corporate class and Biden think. There's another aspect to the free pass that China is essentially getting from the civilized world for its criminal behavior that is equally disturbing. Most human rights groups have condemned China. But is there any doubt about the fact that the international human rights community's real priority is its war on Israel? Last week, Amnesty International issued a report in which it falsely condemned Israel as an apartheid state. Groups which pose as the arbiters of human rights advocacy are investing far more effort on a smear campaign that seeks the elimination of the one Jewish state on the planet than in their protests about the persecution of more than 1 million human beings. The complicity of the United Nations in this, it is launching an open-ended probe of Israel intended to make it a pariah nation, to revive the old Soviet Zionism is racism lie, while doing nothing about China, make this all the more obvious. Some Jewish groups have always been deterred to some extent from speaking out as much about China as they did, for example, about genocide in Darfur earlier in the century, because of the business interests of their large donors. Others in the Jewish community haven't evinced much interest in the issue because they think their sole focus should be on defending Israel and in fighting against the rising tide of anti-Semitism that is spreading across the globe. But the precedent for the use of an Olympics by a human rights offender, the 1936 Berlin Games that were a paean to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime, ought to motivate us to action. Jews are capable of standing up for themselves as well as bearing witness against other human rights disasters. That was the point of Elie Wiesel's teachings about the Holocaust. If we have forgotten that, or worse, never really learned it, then his son is right, that we are failing him and ourselves, as well as the victims of the Chinese Communist Party. And now to our weekly interview. Is unity in the fight against anti-Semitism, as well as in the struggle against human rights abuses, really possible? The political tribal culture war that is dividing Americans against each other in ways that are unprecedented seems to indicate that the notion of people with diverse views working together is outdated. That may be equally true with respect to the Jewish community. A unity rally held in Washington last spring to demonstrate outrage against the outbreaks of anti-Semitism in the United States in the wake of the war between Hamas terrorists and Israel illustrated this. Though it was backed by a wide consensus of Jewish groups, the turnout was minimal, and as a result, perhaps did more harm than good, despite the intentions of the organizers and the noble rhetoric that was heard at the event. Jews are also showing themselves to be as indifferent to the spectacle of the Olympics being held in a country that is committing genocide as most other people are. But that hasn't deterred some from speaking out on both fronts or from invoking the lessons of the Holocaust when advocating against Jew hatred or genocide, no matter the identity of the victims. One such person is our guest this week, who brings a unique perspective to these issues. Elisha Wiesel is the son of Holocaust survivor, author, and Nobel Peace Prize winner Elie Wiesel. After growing up in New York, attending Yale, and then doing basic training for the Israel Defense Forces, he returned to the United States and embarked on a 25-year career on Wall Street with the Goldman Sachs firm, where he eventually became its chief information officer. He retired from the firm in 2019, and though he is on the board of a startup Israeli high-tech firm, since then he has concentrated his efforts on philanthropy, social justice, and political activism. In particular, he has taken up the effort to carry on his father's legacy as an advocate for human rights and bearing witness against anti-Semitism. Elisha Wiesel, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It's great to be with you.
Well, thanks so much for coming on our show. I want to start by asking you about your Anguish Facebook post from last week, in which you expressed your frustration about the world's indifference to genocide in China, as evidenced by the business as usual approach to the holding of the Winter Olympics in Beijing. Tell us why you think we, as Jews and as Americans, human beings in general, are failing, as you wrote, your father, by the general indifference to what's going on in China.
Sure. Look, it's quite troubling. You know, the thing about the Chinese Communist Party is they have such a lockdown on information that it becomes very easy, I think, for people to say, there's no real evidence. Yes, you have some survivor reports. Yes, some people have analyzed the medical data to show that there's an increased rate of sterilization. But really, like, where are the images? You know, if you don't see pictures of concentration camps in great detail, they must not be happening. And I think that's an easy mistake to make because we've become used to being able to have information access to so much of the world and to form judgments on where should our focus be put. But the CCP has such a lockdown on info, it gets very, very tricky. And I think in such a situation, isn't it easier for us to all just look away and say, well, if we're not seeing the information in this era where information is so rich, it must just not be there. And I think that's a mistake. And I think we have to take quite seriously the allegations that we hear about the Uyghurs in China.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point to make. We are so used to the media being there for everything, but it hasn't been there for everything. There was not much coverage of the civil war in Syria, where hundreds of thousands of people were killed and millions were rendered homeless. So as far as most Americans are concerned, it kind of didn't happen. It was the tree falling in the forest, wasn't it?
Yeah, and you know, I think Syria is a little bit different because I'm going to guess it's easier to get information about what's going on in Syria than it is within China. The Uyghur region where it's nestled, much more difficult to get to.
Yeah.
But Syria, there was some information out there to be had.
Well, there were all these refugees with stories. People can't get out of China. That's part of the problem.
Exactly. I mean, as you say, they were overflowing onto the shores of Greece and continental Europe, and they each came with their stories. And in fact, the world couldn't ignore it. You know, countries had to form policy responses around whether or not they were going to accept immigrants. And even there, when there was evidence that there had been crematoria in Syria, even there, it didn't somehow manage to strike a nerve. But I think the scale of what's happening here in China really does deserve our attention.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that as much as you say, there are people who will say, "Well, I didn't see it on the front page of the New York Times every day, so how could it be true?" But it's not as if there's any real doubt about it anywhere expressed. I mean, the various, even UN, not that the UN is willing to do anything about it, but there's a wide variety of sources that have agreed that it's going on. The United States government, the Holocaust Museum in Washington. There isn't really debate about the fact that what's happening to over 1 million Uyghurs, that they're that they're rape, violence. People are being imprisoned, mass imprisonment in the Laogai, the Chinese gulag, as well as murders. it's not as if, there is much skepticism. It's just people don't want to look at it. And the question is, why don't they want to look at it?
Look, there's an answer here, and it's interesting because with Syria, I don't think that the U.S. had deep, extensive business interests with Syria the way so many American corporations do with China. China is viewed as whether you love China because of what it means for labor costs and the fact that your goods can get produced more cheaply, or whether you love it because it's a new market to sell goods and services into, you can't ignore it. It's an economic powerhouse. And the concept of state-sponsored capitalism, what an ingenious idea to still do whatever you want to do in the ethical domain, and yet make yourself indispensable to the Western world. One of the reasons I think it was possible to stand up to the Soviet Union as forcefully as my father did and many other leaders and allies in the movement for Soviet Jewry is it was very clear, not only were the Soviet Union doing things that were unethical and wrong by our standards, but the business interests supported it. There wasn't as much of a massive argument against it, I think, from the business community.
Yeah, I mean, the businesses that were operating in the Soviet Union, there weren't that many. I can recall Pepsi was one, and as a student, as someone who was old enough to remember that movement, we were boycotting Pepsi, and not that really made Pepsi pay a high cost, but it's still, they were outliers. The Soviet Union was not as deeply integrated into the world economy, ironically, as China is. And I guess the turning point on this happened, over 20 years ago when they were integrated into the international economy. Congress stopped having to pass a most favored trading status every year as they did, in the late 1990s. That was an annual vote, and it was an opportunity for a diverse group of people who cared about human rights in China, including labor unions, as well as sort of more conservative groups, to do something about it. But I guess the boat had sailed, on that a while ago.
And of course, it's interesting to me that there's not a ton that the Trump administration and the Biden administration, I think, have agreed on, at least in principle. Item number one that makes me very happy is the Abraham Accords. But I think number two is the thought that what China is doing with the Uyghurs is wrong and needs calling out and needs action.
Yeah. As you wrote, your father was always there to raise his important voice against human rights abuses. But should we really be surprised by the general silence about this, given what happened in things that happened during his lifetime, Rwanda, Sudan, Bosnia, as well as in countless other places where human rights are violated, without the world doing much about it? This isn't really new, is it?
No, it's not new, but I think it hit me for the first time, which is why I wrote that piece, that I can't look to him and say, okay, I can keep doing my life because dad's got this, like on a very personal level. I always felt better knowing that my father was fully engaged in it and had so many leaders around him and allies and such a network. And I'm not sure that we have that in quite the same way today. I don't know. I don't know that anyone can really replace that voice. I certainly am not saying that I can, but collectively it makes me feel that all of those who believe in that message, we each have to sort of step forward and incrementally fill that void that's been left.
Yeah, I think that's true. You mentioned before something that's pretty obvious, the factor of money being, at one of the roots of this problem, because China has such a grip on the American economy. They own so much of America's debt. But is there something deeper going on here that reflects perhaps the failure of Holocaust education to motivate people to actually do something when genocide is actually happening, as opposed to all the lip service for the phrase "never again" that we hear at Holocaust commemorations?
It's a great question. And, I can't claim to know the answer. I don't know what causes motion for different causes. It's clear that we have become activists. In other words, if you look at the country over the last few years, my father used to say, he used to rail against silence. He would rail against indifference. I don't know. If you go into your social media feed, do you really find that people are silent and passive? I find everybody screaming at each other.
Yeah, about a lot of different things. Yeah,
We went straight,
or screaming at me. But that's something else.
but we went straight from silence and indifference really all the way to screaming at each other. So we do have powerfully held views when we feel that justice is at stake or mercy is at stake. What makes certain causes capture the imagination? I don't have a great answer other than maybe it has a little bit to do with what we said earlier. Because George Floyd's video was so, painfully shared, the fact that you had the actual video of the crime. Now, obviously, race relations in this country, have been searing hot forever. So it's a raw nerve for us. But you compound that with an actual video of the event taking place. And that was too much. It was the straw that broke the camel's back, right? A certain community decided that that was just one incident of police brutality too much, and it was going to change. And if that took broken store windows on Fifth Avenue, if that took marches, if that took discussions in corporate boardrooms, there was going to be a change. Somehow, we're not having that moment with the Uyghurs. They're, 10,000 miles away. We don't have videos that can circulate. We have survivor testimonies. We have, satellite imagery of what seem to be camps, but there's not quite the same thing. It's not as TikTokable.
Oh, that's absolutely true. I can go back to, say, the 1990s when an activist like Harry Wu was really speaking up on the issue of human rights in China. It was not then the Uyghurs, it was issues like forced sterilization and the treatment of prisoners and the Laogai in general, their gulag. And that kind of fell pretty flat, as I noted before, China was able to be integrated into the economy. I remember speaking to people, on the left, people on the right, people at the Heritage, Institute in Washington, who were kind of supposedly so right wing, and they were just like, why should we interfere with people making money? Let them make money if they're going to make money. You spent, your first 25 years in the workforce in the business world, so you get that, right?
Sure.
So I guess there is just something, partly Americans don't care about what happens elsewhere. We are, a country that is separated by geography from the rest of the world. We don't speak other languages in this country, generally, other than people who come, more people speak Spanish because there are so many people from Hispanic countries. But in general, the rest of the world is kind of a mystery to most Americans, and a mystery they're not that interested in solving. But when something as big as this happens, you would think it would make more of an impact, but it doesn't.
Well, I have two things about that. The first is, I guess there was a narrative, or at least a thinking, that the way to achieve change is through engagement. So if only we do business with China, they're going to get to know us, they're going to see our norms, and organically over time, we'll have a positive influence on them as they get to experience our culture. I don't think that strategy has been particularly successful, but I think that was a strategy that at different times was actually openly articulated.
Well, I think that's quite true. I mean, I think the first Bush administration, which, at the time of the Tiananmen Square massacre, seemed to take the point of view that direct confrontation with China was not the way to go, that they were just going to evolve. And, especially at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was kind of a triumphalism in the West that, totalitarianism and communism was just doomed no matter what. The Chinese Communist Party leadership had a different idea. And as you said, they came up with something pretty smart in allowing people to make money as long as it didn't affect politics, and as long as they could as long as the government could take it away from them anytime they wanted.
Yeah. And look, I think that I don't know. I wonder if actually there aren't certain aspects of China that the extremists in this country appreciate. I wonder if, some folks on our extreme right don't like the fact that, China can do what it wants with the other with relative impunity. Maybe there are folks on the left who are, quietly cheering when, Jack Ma gets disappeared. and they say, boy, that's sort of a nice way to treat billionaires. Can't we do that? So they're, if you're
I
extreme.
think Tom Friedman has been pretty open. Tom Friedman, the columnist in the New York Times, has at times been pretty open about his respect for the way, the Beijing government gets things done. I mean, it's kind of like the moral equivalent to, Mussolini making the trains run on time. China is able to get away with a lot because they've accomplished a lot in the last generation.
And, you mentioned the phrase of, outright opposition, that was the choice, outright opposition or, economic partnering. And, I think a lot about how my father handled conflict and what his way was. My father was not he always found ways to do things respectfully, even when he took a strong stance and couldn't be budged from it, as with Bitburg and other occasions.
That's a great example. Yeah. For those of our viewers and listeners, Bitburg refers to when President Reagan made a decision to visit a military cemetery at the request of the German government, which actually had some SS graves in it. And your father spoke out so eloquently to President Reagan's face, saying, "This is not your place." Ultimately, he went anyway, but the statement was made.
Yeah, and he wouldn't be budged. And, my father was not a tear down the statues kind of guy, right? I don't think that if my father were thinking about what is the right way to face off to the CCP here, the answer would be some angry mob that's, screaming. I think the question is, can we provoke conversation? Think about how many people in boardrooms across America have read Night. It's got to be like a decent chunk that have read Night. How many of these organizations have line managers that have read Night or department heads that have read Night? It doesn't take more than a few of these at each company to take a look at the headlines, to take a look at the Uyghur situation and say, you know what? I don't actually know what to do, but shouldn't we have a company conversation about it? That to me feels much more of my father's direction. Provoke a conversation. Don't prejudge what the answer is going to be, what form the ethical response has to come, but at least begin the conversation. So if I were talking to, a head of human resources right now at a major Fortune 500 company, I'd be saying that issue deserves the time that you put into any number of company CEO-led conversations. Why not have this one?
Yeah, that's a really important point because, we're living at a time, and it's kind of a completely different subject, where, when the employees of some very major companies get riled up about an issue or because of the company's involvement with somebody whose opinions they don't like, stuff happens as a result of that. We've seen that in journalism. We've seen it in corporations. It is a good question why nobody... Presumably, all the people who've read some of your father's works understand what it means to transport, people away from their homes, put 1 million of them in a concentration camp. Why nobody's making that connection, and yet they aren't. But obviously they should be.
Maybe we just have to ask. Maybe, it's I don't know. Sometimes the idea has to come from somewhere. And then once it takes hold, again, all that I think we're looking for is those conversations. And as you correctly identify, I think that there hasn't been a time in history where workforce political activism has ever been as high. I can't think of one. Maybe there has been. Maybe during the war efforts when our country was actually at war, you saw a lot of that. But the concept of employees having the ability to set the tone on what the company needs to dialogue about socially has to be different than where we were 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Let me get at another angle at this. What do you think of the Jewish community's response to this issue, especially in comparison to the amount of activism that the Darfur genocide in Sudan generated, about 15 years ago? It seems to be a little less, right?
Yeah, although I give a lot of credit to leaders. I know that the Conference of Presidents has been issuing statements. ADL has issued statements. The Rabbinic Assembly, I think World Jewish Watch. Like there are, organizations out there that have been trying to get the word out. So I don't want to say we've been doing nothing. I just don't know that it's been as effective yet as we might hope. The Biden administration did pass the Forced Labor Prevention Act, which I think is a great step, and had the diplomatic boycott of the Olympics, which is interesting as sort of a halfway point. But I think that there is some work coming from the Jewish community. But I also feel that the Jewish community leadership, I mean, if you think about it, aren't we kind of on the back foot in so many ways? We're fighting anti-Semitism from multiple fronts. Nobody believes us when we tell them it's coming from their side as well. Anti-Semitism only comes from the other side of the aisle, never one's own. So Jewish community leadership is doing this dance where they have to please progressives, and and they also have to occasionally remember that the state of Israel exists and needs to be defended. And they're caught in this delicate dance of the modern perspective of our people. So my sense is that because we're a little bit on the back foot and juggling all these things, it's hard to be as forceful and impactful as we could be. And look, I think in our history, we may never see ourselves allied and organized as well as we were for the March for Soviet Jewry and the movement to free Soviet Jewry. But it certainly feels that if we weren't fighting all of these defensive battles against our good name, it might be easier to focus all of our energy in making a change on battles like this.
Well, that's a great point. I think one difference that I have noticed between the Darfur activism and this one is that there were a lot of young Jews who cared a lot. I mean, you're right. Some of the organizations in the alphabet soup world have issued statements that are good, some better than others. But there's been some movement there. But I don't see too many young Jews getting too active about this issue in the way that a lot of them did. With respect to Darfur, I don't think that's there at all.
Yeah, look, I remember my father speaking up for Darfur, and it was getting a lot of attention. And it's interesting, some of the people I've met recently who've come forward to try and be helpful on the Uyghurs are the same ones who were involved with Darfur and remember my father from it. But I will tell you, I was pleased last Thursday to coincide with the opening of the Beijing Olympics. I went to a rally in Times Square. It was raining. It was a small rally, maybe 100, 200 people. And I was pretty pleased that there was a sign, I think it was, Jewish Movement for Uyghur Freedom, that I could actually see. So someone did show up to represent that the Jewish people want to have a voice here too.
Okay, well, better one than none, for
Way
sure. For sure. Let's talk a bit about your efforts to generate Jewish unity against anti-Semitism, which you just referenced. One of the most confounding elements of this issue is the way it has, like everything else in American society, largely become politicized. As you say, people on the left only recognizing anti-Semitism on the right and downplaying it among political allies, while the right does the opposite. You've tried to transcend these differences, especially last spring after an upsurge in anti-Semitism following fighting between Israel and Hamas. How would you evaluate those efforts as well as those of the Jewish community in general?
Look, as an education, it was a first-class education, so I'm grateful to all my teachers who have taught me about just how dysfunctional we are. I now understand and appreciate it in a very deep and personal way. Look, at that time, I remember bombs were falling in Israel, and I was shocked at the absence of Jewish people getting together and marching and showing solidarity and saying, we are up against an enemy who couldn't care less, who wants to see children and elderly civilians killed, destroyed in their homes. It's not a side effect. It's actually the primary cause of what Hamas was trying to achieve. And yet I heard, moral equivalence being bandied about. I really couldn't believe it, that somehow the dialogue on Israel in this country had gotten to the point where somehow we could sit here and judge Israel for all that it needs to do to survive and be secure. And I'm hearing moral equivalence between the IDF and Hamas. And I got very upset, and I started making calls. And I said, where is the support? Where are we going to get together and send an unequivocal message to the media, to all of us who have family watching in Israel, to all of those who care about where we stand on public record on this, that we stand with Israel, that we're not with the terrorists who want to cause civilian casualties. And it was incredibly difficult. I heard a number of fears, Jonathan. I heard a fear that, that the congregations weren't going to be with the rabbis on this. I heard a fear that the Jewish orgs were not going to be with their leaders. And I really heard, above all else, a fear of failure. What if we try and can't succeed? And, my view on this, and we did our best to bring people together in Washington, D.C. My view is that the biggest failure is not to try. No matter what, if you do something and you learn from it. You're always going to be better for the next one, and at least you got to try. I didn't feel good not trying.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, what happened, at the DC rally, and honestly, I wrote about it myself. I was, really troubled that only, only a few hundred or a couple of thousand, depending on who's counting, as always happens at rallies. It seemed to me that more people show up for all any kind of stupid cause. In Washington, you can get more people than that, and yet we couldn't do that, even though you had really done a great job helping to put together a coalition that really encompassed the right, left, and center of Jewish life. But those groups didn't exactly put together busloads of people to show up. I'm not faulting you.
No. Listen,
but they didn't.
It's a great observation, and you have to realize, the deciding where we were going to put the tent poles for that event, and we decided that our tent poles was you have to be committed to the peace and security of Jews, both here in the States and overseas, including in Israel. That we all have a right to fight anti-Semitism, whether it's here or in Israel. And even that, I tell you, J Street wouldn't come. They said, how can we possibly come? They didn't want to come. We had all sorts of issues where, the folks that were more on the right wanted to really dominate the messaging. And we tried to create, a compromise space where can we not all agree on certain things. And it was very challenging to hold that and keep that together. But at the end of the day, what we produced in terms of content was quite remarkable. We had a young man who had personally been, attacked in his car in Illinois because he had been brandishing, an Israeli flag, and he saw the violence up close and personal. And he got up there and said how he was joining Tzahal, the IDF, and he quoted Begin. And then minutes later, we had, Rabbi David Saperstein from the Reform Movement come up and, use the word occupation. Both obviously controversial to anybody from a different political perspective, yet these two people were able to share and coexist on a stage with solidarity on the message that we, the Jewish people, deserve to live in peace and security here and in Israel. So that's something.
It is. I think, if it didn't have, greater resonance, which I agree it should have, I think it was a great idea, and, your compromise was good. But it is a function of the bifurcation of American society, in which we're involved in this, tribal culture war, where, the two sides, are just at war with each other. Everybody seems to fit into one or the other. And, you read, watch, listen different media, and you isolate yourself from people who disagree with you, on social media, where you can just delete any view or unfriend anybody that says something that you disagree with. We've lost the ability to listen to each other. So, why should we be surprised that Israel is now part of that? And indeed, isn't it part of that in terms of, in terms of partisanship? There is a debate within the Democratic Party that didn't used to be there about not about Israeli policies, but about Zionism. That's the real challenge, isn't it?
Yeah, it sure is. And, look, how much of this, goes back to, it has its roots in the Obama administration and the Iran deal and all that followed, Netanyahu, Boehner, and then the Trump administration. And by the way, what President Trump did in announcing that Jerusalem was going to be the United States embassy location, he was merely following through on what was already established U.S., congressional desire. He was following on something that
U.S. law, right?
U.S. law, right? And yet, because it's Trump and half of the country sits there and says, that must also be bad. I think, or it becomes another excuse. So we're so politicized. We're so in this cult of personality. And Jonathan, one thing that I tried to do, and I can't say I've done it particularly successfully, but where I've done it, it's been helpful. I tried to make for myself last year a little bit of a scorecard in my political conversations. And whereas I used to grade myself on, did I get across my points effectively? Did I defuse an opposing argument? I actually switched and I started keeping a different metric, which is at the end of the conversation, did I feel closer to the other person than I did when I started? And with that metric, I actually found that the political dialogue got better and enriched, and there were more opportunities for exchange of ideas.
Yeah, I think that's a good, that's a good way to approach it, because as I said, we've lost the ability to listen to each other, or even to debate civilly, in any way, and that's had an impact on all of these issues. Part of it, is it, Dara Horn said when we were talking about anti-Semitism, Dara Horn's popular book about people love dead Jews. That's part of this equation, isn't it? That people are always willing to, be mobilized to express outrage about the Nazis, but when it comes to live Jews today, it's a very different issue, isn't it?
Particularly live Jews who are willing to defend themselves and don't want to be thrown on the world's mercy,
Yeah,
which
exactly.
is
Well,
the state of Israel.
that's the thing about Israel now. Um, so when we speak about this, I mean, I talked about Holocaust education before. There are some who believe, people like Ruth Weiss, the great Jewish scholar, believes that we've done too much universalizing of the Holocaust. That was an issue that your father gave a great deal of thought to. And where do you see this now? I mean, we speak often of that there isn't enough Holocaust education, but I wonder whether the Holocaust education that we have been promulgating hasn't had kind of the opposite effect. I mean, all of the you know promiscuous use of Holocaust analogies on the right, with people comparing vaccine mandates to yellow stars and the treatment of Jews by the Nazis, and on the left, where basically anybody on the right or Trump, they're Nazis, and that's including some seemingly very sensible people, being so polarized that they're willing to use that analogy. Uh, have we kind of failed there?
Look, my father thought obviously quite hard about the right way to explain the uniqueness of the Holocaust and what it meant for Jews. And his quote is, not all of the, victims of the Holocaust were Jews, but all
Mm-hmm.
Jews were victims. And I spend a lot of my time thinking about my father's legacy as a universal figure, but also as a Jewish figure. And I find that I'm spending a lot of time these days really defending his Jewish character and his Jewish origin, and reminding people how profoundly and devoutly identified he was with Judaism. So, earlier in the fall, the National Cathedral honored my father by putting a bust of my father's likeness in the Porch of Human Rights in the entryway, alongside, I think, Mother Teresa and Rosa Parks. And, I went and gave a speech there that was all about my father's not only Jewish character, but I went out of my way to make it a Zionist speech, because I felt that every other speech that would be given that night, I had a feeling even before I saw the program, and it only solidified as the program took shape, that it was going to be a universalist commemoration, because my father's
Mm-hmm.
going to appear in the National Cathedral because of his universalist work. And I felt it was very important that there should be at least one voice that was proudly, stridently, clearly, and unambiguously bringing forth my father's Jewish character, his Jewish beliefs, and his affiliation and defense of the Jewish people.
Yeah. Well, I think that's so important, and for those of us who really studied your father's work, it seems obvious, but when it gets just distilled into symbolism, it gets forgotten. That's right. What impact, broadening this discussion, what impact do you think that the impact of critical race theory and intersectionalism has had on the discussion about anti-Semitism? And do you think this was kind of illustrated by the recent dust-up over Whoopi Goldberg's comments about it on the View, where she spoke of the Holocaust just being white people doing it to white people?
Look, the whole concept of there being a pyramid of victimhood is such a terrible idea, and I think really a not very Jewish idea. I
Hmm.
feel that if anything, you look at the way Holocaust survivors rebounded from what they went through and did everything they could, despite the fact that, by the way, there was real anti-Semitism in this country, when they arrived. There were many golf clubs you couldn't play at. There were many business opportunities you couldn't be part of. My former employer, I think, the business lines that Goldman Sachs started in the commercial paper business, these were because, more white shoe avenues were not necessarily open to Jewish families and businessmen at the time. So the approach was very different. The approach was, we are going to invest in our families, in the family unit, the family structure. We're going to invest in passing on a sense of tradition, and we're going to work like hell, and we're going to do what we can to succeed. And it's just it's a different approach. And I feel that a lot of what we've had with critical race theory is this concept of who is more of a victim and how many points do you get if you're a different kind of victim. I'm not saying that there isn't real pain there. Of course, there's pain that needs to be addressed. And the healing of America from slavery and all that we've been through, it's going to take, a long time. I think it's always going to be part of our national character that this sin happened on our soil and colored us for so many of our aspects for so long. But the idea that people are born innately having done something wrong because of the color of their skin, I think is antithetical to Jewish values. And, I just don't hold with it.
Yeah, I think that's a very succinct criticism of the whole idea of white fragility and white privilege. Let's turn to your own experience. You've spoken a lot since your father's death about his influence on you and about his legacy. But what can you tell us, even those who have read every one of his many books, or many of them, about him that we might not know, which will help us understand him better?
Oh, I appreciate that. There's a concept in Jewish teaching. There's Torah shebichtav, the Torah that is written down, the Jewish law that's written, and Torah shebe'al peh, the oral tradition. And the oral tradition around my father, the thing you might not get from reading his speeches or reading his books, is really what a great person he was in person. He treated every single human being that he came in contact with incredible respect. He would listen to them. Sometimes at a 92nd Street Y lecture, you would have maybe 50, 60 people lined up to get an autograph or tell them that they're distantly related or share an experience of how his words had moved them, or maybe something completely different they wanted to share. My father would make time for each and every one of them. I might be tugging at him to get out of there. My mom might be saying, enough already, we have to go to dinner. He would sit there and just talk to every person. And if one of them wanted to explain how they were fourth cousins 3 times removed, he would sit there and try to place it and make them feel heard and make them feel acknowledged. And it wasn't just at his lectures. If he was in a taxi cab and a cab driver from Bangladesh wanted to talk about his 7 children and what each of them were doing, my father would listen and ask questions and was genuinely interested. And he wanted to connect with people. And I think he truly saw every human being as having the divine spark. And felt that it was a worthy pursuit to engage.
Wow, that's a great insight, and that does add texture to the vision of us that vision of him that we have just from reading his work. Um, Many children of survivors, as we know, have struggled with the burden of their parents' pain, sometimes often suffering from their own version of PTSD. Was that the case for you growing up with someone who wasn't merely a survivor, but perhaps the world's most famous witness to the Holocaust?
Yeah, I'm very fortunate, I think, to have experienced all my PTSD at a young age, so that I could have it off my shoulders in time for my midlife crisis. It was not easy, I'll tell you. And again, maybe a stronger person would have found it easier. But as a 14, 15-year-old kid discovering themselves and figuring out where they stood in the social pecking order that is high school, to have a father who was so prominent, and I went to a yeshiva, to be known purely as an extension of my father, a shadow of my father, it was kind of crushing. I wanted anything but, and it really led to a wholesale rejection of as much as I could that came from my father's direction. So, I got a lot of that kind of out of the way early, I would say.
Okay, well, that's I guess healthy, but it's a serious issue, and certainly, these are that plays into the children of other famous people have struggled with that, but I guess you turned out okay. I, I think your father thought so as well. Um, what are your primary personal goals now, as you seem to have kind of taken up some of his work. I know that wasn't your career goal, but you came to a point in your life where you left. You had 25 years at Goldman Sachs, and then you retired from that, and now are doing other things, whether it's philanthropy or I know you're involved with a startup in Israel. What is the goal for you right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's hard for me to see out more than a few years, but for now I have the benefit of my kids still living at home with me. They're teenagers. And for me, I know it sounds trite, but the family really is the focus. I have the ability to help tutor my daughter in her math homework every so often, and that's an incredible luxury to be able to do that on a Sunday afternoon without worrying about a crush of work. I have the ability to, study a page of Gemara and or Talmud, and if the page is interesting, to pull them into it and talk to them about it. I have the ability to do a lot of these things, with my kids right now. So that's kind of the top priority. And I think when I think about my father's legacy, the legacy that's most important to me is raising my kids very grounded in their Jewish identity and understanding that, Shabbat is not some horrible set of oppressive laws and why do people do that? No, it's a joyful Friday night dinner table with lit candles and guests full of conversation and debate and song and ritual. So I spend a lot of time thinking about how to make that a set of memories that when, 10, 20 years from now, my children have their own choices to make, whether to marry Jewish or not, whether to have any observance, whether to continue affiliation with this people that we're part of, that they will have memories rooted in joy as opposed to just a feeling of I have to. So that's a big part of how I spend my time.
Well, that's a good lesson for all parents, all families, all Jewish families. Part of a very big issue that we all face in terms of Jewish demography in this country, but a great personal lesson. What, if anything, would you, right now we've talked about some of these important issues that, have evinced your interest in terms of, what's going on in China, anti-Semitism. What do you want Jews to be doing right now? What do you want them to take away from your father's legacy? If you have one message to give to the Jewish public, what is it?
Listen, my father was always very clear because he had a message that applied to Jews and non-Jews. If he was speaking to Jews, he would always say, be the best Jew you can be, because that's how he measured himself. His question for himself at the end of his life was going to be, was I a good Jew? And of course, you could double click on that and unpack it in many different ways. And then he would say the same thing. If you're a Muslim, be the best Muslim you can be. If you're a Christian, be the best Christian you can be. If you're an atheist, be the best atheist you can be with whatever moral code you've come to. And I think that crosses across a number of dimensions. I think he wanted Jews to be more Jewish. So I would encourage people to think about what they are leaving behind for their children. As you say, we're in this time where things are so uncertain about Jewish demographics, our ability to perpetuate something that our kids feel is worth perpetuating. But he also felt that there was a universal aspect to Judaism. My father spoke on the world stage for universal causes because of his Judaism. And, right now for me today, the question is, can we get the Uyghurs introduced into corporate conversation when so many ethical issues are being debated? Can we just include this one in the conversation too?
Yeah, that's a great message and very important. Elisha Wiesel, I want to thank you so much for your time, your insights, and your perspective. We also want to thank our audience, whether you're listening to us on Spotify or any of the other podcast platforms, watching us on the JNS YouTube channel or on JBS TV. Please like and or subscribe to Top Story and give us good reviews. Please let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And we'll see you again next week.